Formidable Caribbeanists and committed digital scholars both, Kelly and Alex have been extraordinary partners in crafting this event and in dreaming up the possible futures of the Small Axe Project's engagement with multimodal humanities scholarship in and emerging from the Caribbean. And I'm very, very grateful for their patience and for their generosity. At the very foundations of this concept, we've called the Caribbean digital. And now I'm going to quote from pretty much everything and anything we've put on paper or online about this event, so bear with me if you've seen any of it. Here I go. At the very foundations of this concept is our firm conviction that the internet is analogous in important ways to the Caribbean itself as multivalent, hybrid, and infinitely fluid cultural space. It's generated from disparate places and by disparate peoples. It defies the geographical and physical barriers that disrupt or disallow connection, and it places others and elsewheres in relentless relation. And so we wanted, as researchers, editors, and teachers, to celebrate in a sustained and, we hope, in a generative way, these opportunities for dynamic connectedness. And we're well aware that many of you have been doing this work now for some time, and so our most basic intention here with this forum is to offer you space, a space within which the many satellites of the Caribbean digital can come into closer orbit. But at the same time, both in laying out the guiding principles of this event and via the fact of this very dangerously tech-heavy forum, yes, we also wanted to be sure to think responsibly about not just the possibilities, but the limitations of the digital. To what extent is it really possible to facilitate conversation and to build scholarly community in the absence of physical presence? Without the bother, yes, of visas and expensive plane fares in the middle of high season, but also very much vulnerable to the inevitable challenges and snafus of technology. So otherwise put, we are praying that the Skype and the live stream are going to work. But I'll just say, we've set this stage and we've conceived of this forum as a space of conversation, interrogation, and good old-fashioned show and tell. We embrace the challenges and we look forward to being surprised. But before we do anything else, I want to take a few moments to thank everyone who's been involved in helping to pull this off, besides Kelly and Alex. We've been generously supported by Columbia's Center for the Study of Social Difference, which has understood from the beginning the extent to which thinking the digital humanities in the so-called Global South is as much an ethical and a political project as it is a social and creative one. I also thank the members of the Digital Black Atlantic Project Working Group, funded by the Center for the Study of Social Difference. This group's input and enthusiasm has helped us enormously in shaping this event. I also want to thank Barnard College's Committee for Online and On-Campus Learning, led by the inimitable Janet Jacobson, and they were pretty much like, go, do, here's a chunk of money, let us know what you figure out. So it's actually not a coincidence that their acronym is COOL, cool, because they really are. Committee for Online On-Campus Learning. Anyway, I want to thank the folks at the Columbia Center for Digital Research and Scholarship, aka CEDARS. They are the indispensable edifice holding up our website and therefore our digital credibility to some extent as a digital event. And then speaking of our website, thanks to Rodell Warner, rodellwarner.com, whose stunning image embodies technology at its most exquisite. A few more people, the Barnard College Africana Studies Department, and especially our administrative assistant, Catherine McLean, who has known and handled everything that needs knowing and handling when I have found myself feeling more than a little bit hapless. Thank you also to events management and to the instructional media and technology services team. They looked at me like I was crazy when I told them all the tech things that we wanted to do for this event, but they never said no, or they never said a hard no, let's say, because they did a couple of times say no. And then finally, two other folks. One, Yasmin Espert, our graduate assistant, who has been an indefatigable and essential collaborator and facilitator, and she must be very, very tired. So please be very, very nice to her whenever you see her, if she'll let you hug her. And lastly, my thanks and our thanks to David Scott, who's just come in, the founder and the heart of the Small Axe Project. If you ask him, he will claim to have been recalcitrant when it came to Alex, Kelly, and my fervor regarding going all in with the digital in Small Axe. And it's true that, like me, and maybe even a little more than me, he has taken his time. But the fact of the matter is, David has been as rigorous, as visionary, and as committed to this new valence of Caribbean studies as he has long been in building Small Axe and, through that journal, building what is today our common field of interest and its disciplines. And now with that, I'll cede the podium to Sharon Marcus, who will say a few words about the digital humanities as they are at present at Columbia and where she sees them headed in the future. She is the relatively newly appointed Dean of the Humanities for the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and the Orlando Harriman Professor of English and Comparative Literature. Sharon, Dean Marcus, is as textual as she is digital in her interests and expertise. Not only has she received professional awards too numerous to mention for her 2000 study Between Women, Friendship, Desire, and Marriage in Victorian England, suffice it to say the phrase best book is pretty much in all of the awards she's received. But she's also the founder and the editor-in-chief of Public Books, an innovative and often provocative online monthly review of books. And so now, really lastly, I just want to say we are live streaming, at least in principle, through our website. And we have a hashtag, right? Hashtag SXCD2014. So we welcome all of you here and also all of you out there to be part of this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Kaiama, and I want to start by thanking and congratulating Kaiama Glover and Kelly Baker-Josephs and Alex Heel for putting on this amazing event. I would like to begin by extending the analogy between the digital and the internet and the Caribbean that the call for papers put forward and that Kaiama reminded us of by saying that the same analogy could be made about the university and the internet. But the university is not as networked as the internet, nor is it as networked as the Caribbean. In doing academic planning these past few months as part of my work as dean, I've been thinking a lot about making connections between departments, connections between divisions, connections between schools. And let's not forget the many centers and institutes. Often one finds that people in individual departments are working on something and they think they're absolutely unique in doing so, but if one has the privilege of being able to speak to many of them, one finds that many departments and many faculty are interested in the digital. Many are interested in environmental humanities. And it's really been terrific to be able to connect these people and say, well, what happens if you all speak with each other and work together? So part of my work as dean, I am now able to think of as linking the departmental islands in the university archipelago. But the digital actually turns out to be one of the ways to link departments, not so much because we need to go online to talk to each other. It isn't quite that bad yet. People can usually just walk down the hall or to another building. But because an interest in the digital is one of the things that links different departments. So projects ranging from the digital Black Atlantic to digital Dante, people using online tools to annotate liturgical medieval manuscripts, a new course on the virtual Enlightenment here at Barnard. These are a range of the kinds of projects that are using the digital here at Columbia. The academic initiative that is involved in thinking about planning for an imminent fundraising campaign and also for just the next decade of what lies ahead has put the digital front and center in many different ways, but is still, I think, a bit too nascent to have a detailed public rollout here. But in emphasizing what the humanities in particular will bring to thinking about the digital, I'm actually going to quote a student named Meredith Miles of Manan Ahmed, who is here in the audience. And Manan and I were emailing recently, and he said, yes, we were talking about a proposal he's been putting together with Alex and Dennis Tennant in the English department and many, many other faculty. And he said, you know, I was talking with a student, and she said, we use the digital. We're always hearing about how the digital can be used to study the humanities, but what about using the humanities to think critically about the digital? And I think one of the really central things about this conference is that the two are flowing together all the time. People are using the affordances of the digital in all kinds of ways to think about the Caribbean, but also thinking critically through a Caribbean lens, especially about what the dangers of the digital are, what are the gaps. I had a really fabulous time reading through all the abstracts, and so if I may, I'm going to end by just giving a preview, which may be superfluous. You've probably done the same thing, but it's always good to be reminded of stuff. A preview of what you have in store and the kinds of critical thinking about the digital that will be going on over the next 2 days. You'll be hearing about docs instead of MOOCs, distributed online collaborative courses that are offering a different model, a less hierarchical pyramid scheme-like model of what can be achieved with digital technology and pedagogy. You're going to be hearing about redressing digital divides and gaps and recovering and remixing the histories embedded in sources that are in part designed to cover the histories of slavery and the voices of slaves, but that nonetheless those voices are there and can be recreated in the interesting ways we have now of re-annotating text. But at the same time, you're going to be hearing about the cautions that we have to exercise because, as with everything, the digital can become, and information networks can become new vectors of governmentality, and these always go hand in hand. You're going to be hearing about sonic archives, digital museums, online annotation. You're going to be hearing about how spaces can be mapped, real and imagined, from Kamau Brathwaite's cosmologies to Unia Kampalu's imaginary world of Naniki, so some environmental humanities intersecting with the digital. You're going to be hearing about the multimedial, the multilingual, the multi-authorial, dance, music, poetry, film, rhythm, even how Twitter and the Duan walk in the same backwards directions at many occasions. This was one of my favorite abstracts that I got to read. And you're going to be hearing about cyberfeminism and sexual cultures. And I think in the wake of the last 2 months, where it seems like every day we look at the news and we're hearing about the ongoing legacy of the depredations of capitalism and slavery and the inequities in which lives matter and the ongoing problems that we have in many cultures with sexual assault, I think it's especially important that there are parts of the conference devoted to thinking about sexuality and feminism. Because as we also know, one of the big problems with the internet is that while there's a potential for all voices to be equal, some voices and some people spend a lot of their time using their technical skills to drown certain voices out. And so it's a constant fight to keep the potential for equality and change that these new technologies have, to keep those potentials realized. And I think that these 2 days are part of that battle and that vision. And I congratulate you on getting to spend the next 48 hours being part of that. Thank you.
Here we go. Hello, I'm Kelly Josephs, one of the organizers of this wonderful event. Many of us in the room are coming from a Brathwaite research-thon that we conducted earlier over at the studio at Butler in the Butler Library at Columbia University. So it was a great way to sort of kick off the event for us informally by thinking about Kamau Brathwaite's work and building a bibliography collaboratively. We ended up with almost 550 entries for the day, which was amazing. And it was only that much, the tip of the iceberg of his work. So we've already accomplished a lot, and we have so much more to look forward to. So I'm here just to introduce and moderate afterwards this, or first session. Let me grab this. And before that, I'll just remind you that should you feel like tweeting some of the brilliant stuff that you're about to hear, or hashtag is SXCD 2014. So our panel this evening is on pioneering the Caribbean digital. It's a collaborative panel. Really 2 presentations, but they're intertwined because the first one, which will be Donette Francis from the University of Miami, Leah Rosenberg from the University of Florida, and Rhonda Cobham Sander from Amherst College. Those 3 professors will be presenting on researching and teaching with the digital archive. They used they relied heavily on DLOC, the Digital Library of the Caribbean, to pull their project together, which I'll talk about in just a second, but that's how that connects to our fourth panelist, who's Brooke Wooldridge from the Digital Library of the Caribbean. So the first presentation, just a slight bit on it, Donette, Leah, and Rhonda are going to present on a class that they collaborated to create as well as teach on overlapping Asian and Afro-Caribbean labor diasporas in the Americas. And I have to say that I was teaching a class this spring, and in doing my research for the class and in teaching the class, every time I had to do a search for something pedagogical, I would run into something from the course, either your proposal from the year before or things that you were doing. So I knew about this class a while before, and so I'm very excited to hear your notes on how it went and more on the Distributed Online Collaborative course. And then Brooke will be talking more about the Digital Library of the Caribbean, which is a cooperative digital library for resources from and about the Caribbean and circum-Caribbean. It relies now on 38 content contributing partners and 15 financially supporting members. It's a huge undertaking, and if you don't already know about it and rely on it, you soon probably will. I'm going to do the bios just directly and then hand over the floor. Donette Francis is Associate Professor of English and Director of the American Studies Program at the University of Miami. She's the author of Fictions of Feminine Citizenship, Sexuality and the Nation in Contemporary Caribbean Literature, and is currently working on her second book project, Generational Refusal, a promiscuous archive of independence. Leah Rosenberg is Associate Professor of English at the University of Florida and author of Nationalism and the Formation of Caribbean Literature. She's also co-editor with J. Dillon Brown of Beyond Windrush, Rethinking Post-War Anglophone Caribbean Literature, due out next year. She serves on the Academic Advisory Board for the Digital Library of the Caribbean. Rhonda Cobham Sander received her BA from the University of West Indies, Jamaica, and her PhD from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. She is currently completing a book-length manuscript on Caribbean poets Derek Walcott and Edward Kamau Brathwaite. She has co-edited Watchers and Seekers, an anthology of writing by Black women in Britain, and was the guest editor of a special issue of Research in African Literatures on African women writers, as well as an issue of the Massachusetts Review devoted to contemporary Caribbean culture and art. Brooke Wooldridge is the program director for the Digital Library of the Caribbean, which we call DLOC, a collaborative digital library, as I said, with more than 35 partners. DLOC provides free online access to digitized versions of the Caribbean cultural, historical, and research materials currently held in archives, libraries, and private collections. And Brooke will tell you so much more about DLOC. So I hand over the floor first to Donette. Nope, first to Brooke. No. Okay, I'll sit.
You might have to give us one chair. You might have to give us your chair.
Oh, okay. I can do that, yes.
So we're going to do a sort of two-hander here. Leah and I are going to present bits of the first part, and then Donette is going to sum up. And really, Brooke is part of the same song and dance routine as well, right? Because we've been working together for a really long time. So Leah and I are going to start and hand off to each other, and then Donette is going to take over from there to be followed by Brooke. Okay? Thanks, Faith. Let us know if you can't hear. Okay?
Okay, so as Kelly just explained, Rhonda and I will be discussing the hybrid collaborative course that she, I, and Donette designed and taught simultaneously on our 3 different campuses with a great deal of help from librarians. Okay. and explain, perhaps as importantly, how it transformed our understanding of the relationship between the digital humanities, the digital archive, and pedagogy. The course introduced students to the digital humanities through an analysis of the historical archive and the literary representations of two often overlooked migrations that shaped the modern Caribbean, that of indentured Asians to the Caribbean and that of Caribbeans, mostly Afro-Caribbeans, to Panama. It was an experiment in decentralized, collaborative, blended learning using technology and open access resources. One of my colleagues called it an anti-MOOC, 3 faculty teaching the same small class simultaneously at 3 institutions. Instead of producing revenue by commodifying and disseminating knowledge from one institution, we sought to produce knowledge collectively and to make that knowledge available, open access, in support of teaching Caribbean studies across the globe. As Donette will emphasize in her presentation, this was a collaboration in which librarians, archivists, DH specialists, faculty, and students participated. These included at Amherst, Missy Roser, head of research and instruction at the Frost Library, and Kimberly Bain, who is in the audience, who was then an undergraduate and TA in Rhonda's course. At Miami, Beatrice Skokin in special collections, and Vanessa Rodriguez in e-learning and emerging technologies. And at Florida, Donashri Thorat, a PhD candidate, Lori Taylor, digital scholarship librarian and technical director of the Digital Library of the Caribbean, as well as Margarita Vargas Betancourt, Caribbean Basin archivist, as well as other librarians. This was a pilot for intercollegiate digital humanities courses, and as such, we received modest funding from each institution, which we pooled to fund guest lecturers, digitization, and training sessions for us. The course continues to be an experiment in what technologies are useful for collaborative use. And we ended up using a shared wiki, Zotero, and video conferencing for connecting the 3 classes and connecting with scholars. Since 2007, I have been working with DLOC to build its collection of early Anglophone Caribbean literature, and this course started from Rhonda's desire to teach students research methods for using DLOC, and out of our mutual interest in the newly digitized writings of the Jamaican newspaper editor H.D. DeLisser. We focused on the ways in which hitherto invisible female subjects moved more clearly into focus as the DLOC collection grew. From these conversations, the idea for the course was born, and once Donette joined us, we were able to scale up the project.
So, our project, one of the things that we should also mention is that we found DLOC did not have as much information about the Indo-Caribbean and Chinese Caribbeans as it did about Afro-Caribbeans. And this was another of the things that we were thinking of when we began to think about the course. Because our project challenges how scholars think and write about the Caribbean. The largest immigration of indentured Asian laborers into the Caribbean took place between 1838 and 1917, while Afro-Caribbean workers migrated to Panama to build the Panama Railroad and then the canal, primarily between 1850 and 1921, 1838, 1917, 1850, 1921. Despite the snug chronological overlap between the Panama and Asian migrations, however, literary historians seldom consider them side by side as different aspects of a single historical event, the massive global movement of labor between colonial territories that dominated the period between emancipation and the Second World War. They start instead with the West Indian exodus to England after the Second World War, from which the London-based male Afro-Caribbean writer of slender means but ample erudition emerges as the prototype for all Caribbean writers. Asian Caribbean writers figure to the extent that they demarcate the good and evil limits of this narrative trajectory. The good being represented by the Creolized Samuel Selvin, whose works can be made to blend invisibly into the Afro-Caribbean canon, the evil being represented by Naipaul, the supercilious outsider. Yet, even when literary historians take pains to challenge these stereotypes, they rarely stop to ask how the education that supported all these writers was financed. Our project intervenes in this narrative by focusing on the literary implications of the Asian and Panama migration simultaneously. We maintain that the movement of people, wealth, and ideas between colonized territories in the 19th and early 20th centuries bankrolled an emergent middle strata in the Caribbean, whose mobility did not depend exclusively on white patronage, and whose access to modernist notions of subjectivity, as well as new ways of accumulating capital, destabilized the Caribbean social order. Despite being subjected to dire working conditions and discriminatory practices, the migrants accumulated enough wealth to raise levels of education significantly among their descendants. Moreover, the ideas about nationalism, working class organization, and racial solidarity they acquired or passed on from Gandhi's India, Chiang Kai-shek's China, and the Central America of Simon Bolivar and Marcus Garvey disrupted entrenched attitudes towards subaltern powerlessness. Finally, the social dislocation of travel itself allowed both groups to reconfigure their interpellation as modern subjects in spaces beyond the immediate reach of caste systems or the plantation's racial hierarchies. Such massive social and political transformation was not without its contradictions. Migrants destabilized hierarchies at both ends of the social spectrum, exacerbating social and financial insecurities among increasingly embattled traditional elites and inflaming envy and suspicions among those who did not immediately share in their success. Literary representations of both groups often reproduce this deep ambivalence within the society at large about migrant status as social interlopers. It may even have led the Caribbean intellectuals who were beneficiaries of these social movements to minimize or overlook the extent to which their aspirations had been furthered by the very social transformations their work often criticized. So we've put up some of the objectives and assignments for the course, and you can certainly read these while I speak. So in addition to enhancing DLOC's collection and introducing students to research methods and aesthetic concerns, we sought to illuminate the archive's limits. Two of our readings, Sadiya Hartman's The Dead Book and Vereen Shepard's Maharani Misery, in particular, highlighted the impossibility of recuperating a complete archive or of understanding the subjectivities of the lives it documents. So to move on to some of the conceptual underpinnings, we grounded the course on two other conceptual texts. Michel Rolfe Trouillot's Silencing the Past gave students a keen sense of how power shapes our understanding of archives and historical narratives so that some voices are heard and others silenced. Lisa Lowe's Intimacies of Four Continents demonstrated to students that colonial archives rarely document the ways in which, and this is a quote from her work, the variety of contacts among slaves, indentured persons, and mixed-blood freed peoples living together on the islands resulted in the collision of European, African, and Asian components within the Caribbean plantation. Yet these very archives constantly project anxieties about the potentially corrupting effects of that mixing. The racial classifications in the archives arose, claims Lowe, in the context of the colonial need to prevent these unspoken intimacies among the colonized. Colonized subjects appropriated the rhetoric of liberal humanism, demanding rights as individuals to benefit from emerging understandings of freedom as self-possession, as control of intimate spaces, and as control of the terms of labor within the marketplace. Thus, the colonial archive documents how these modern subjects enlisted the institutions of civil society, the court, the bank, the contract, the newspaper, and the marketplace for goods and labor to secure their claims.
So in organizing the class, we devoted the first half to assignments that taught students how to use specific types of research materials and how they constructed immigrant identity, colonial reports, photographs, newspapers, and oral histories, and to compare these with literary representations. We learned, however, that it would be more effective to integrate the use and critical assessment of DH in general and specific DH tools into these assignments, so that we would pair specific tools with specific research documents, types of primary sources. TEI encoding with newspapers, for instance, and Omeka, with colonial photography. This places in relation the critique of the colonial archive with the critique of the contemporary formation of the digital archive. Students consider what it means to be creating a digital archive from our position of empire, the far-reaching significance of the Anglo-American dominance in digital humanities and in shaping the language and infrastructure of the internet, and how, as a result, specific tools shape and limit our knowledge. In the second half of the course, students use these skills to enhance the metadata of archival items in DLOC. Many chose photographs from the Panama Canal Museum collection, recently donated to the University of Florida, as the possession of former white U.S. employees of the Panama Canal. It is an concretely imperial archive, and in attempting to enhance its metadata, students saw the challenges and opportunities posed by migrating the colonial into the digital archive. And this is an example of one of my students' assignments. Chelsea Mullen chose this photograph because it presented a black subject in a central position, but omits him from the caption, which is East Chamber of the Gatun Lock. This is typical of the many, many thousands of photographs of the canal construction. However, by adding West Indian labor to the notes or subject keywords, students made black workers searchable and thus visible. And they also saw that without such changes, many items would enter the digital world with colonialist, incomplete, and misleading metadata. Similarly, students saw how few online sources were available for many of the Caribbean authors that they studied, and they were very motivated to create Wikipedia pages to redress that marginalization. And here are some of the examples of their final assignments, which were DH projects that curated, online curated exhibits, visualization products that illuminated aspects of these marginalized histories and literature that they studied. In addition, one of the main goals of the course was actually to build DLOC, as Rhonda mentioned, in these areas, and to engage students not only in enhancing DLOC through metadata, and by us identifying and getting permissions and money for funding the digitization of new materials, but also to include the students' final projects, as well as other scholarly work and our videos of guest lecturers, our assignments, our lecture notes, and questions, and so on. And we're going to teach the course again in the spring of 2016, but more importantly, we are trying to kind of extend the project through international collaboration, and one of the most important one of those that we've been engaging in so far is with the Society of the Friends of the West Indian Museum of Panama, which actually donated one of the most important documents that we've added to DLOC, which is the accounts written by laborers on the Panama Canal.
So what does this juxtaposition make visible? Read alongside the Panama migration, Asian migration and the literature it produced no longer figures as a sidebar in the story of Caribbean literary formation. The two become part of a single story about the emergence of a modern, literate Caribbean subject. For example, popular representations of Indo-Caribbean laborers as miserly and Panama returnees as profligate are ubiquitous in Caribbean literature, and it would be difficult to think of two more opposite racial stereotypes. Yet, taken together as attempts to account for changes in the Caribbean social order at the beginning of the 20th century, the two images read as opposite sides of the same coin. I don't actually have the two images, but some of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with the image of the Panama returnee with his Panama hat and his gold bangles and all that sort of stuff. For both groups, money had begun to replace patron-client relations as the currency of social mobility. Thus, many of the contemporaneous photographs and documents located in the archives presented Asian migrants, both Chinese and Indian, in terms of the very stereotypes about flaunting wealth applied to Panama workers. And I wanted to mention, Joy Mahabia has a wonderful blog piece that talks about this and uses some of these images and points out that this familiar exoticized picture of the Indian woman with all the gold bangles and all that sort of stuff is actually a product of the Caribbean return migrants. That's not what Indian women usually came with. It's what they could go back with once they had accumulated wealth in the Caribbean, if they indeed went back. Conversely, contemporaneous accounts of Panama migrants hoarding money to buy land back home sound very similar to later literary representations of miserly, land-hungry Indian peasant farmers. Other parallels include how minority English language communities in Panama and Bhojpuri-speaking communities in the Caribbean survived, often preserving archaic linguistic forms that had begun to erode back home. Appeals by both groups to modern courts or to constitutional protection as British subjects, and perhaps most surprisingly, a rich record of laborers' movements back and forth between Asia and the Caribbean, which, at least in the early years of indenture, was as vigorous as the repeat migrations between Panama and the Caribbean, and in some cases among Chinese migrants, has continued to the present day. In both cases, large groups of migrants eventually settled in their new homes and allowed the links to their places of origin to attenuate. And in both cases, these choices had significant literary, linguistic, and economic consequences in the host countries as well as in their countries of origin. Finally, in both cases, the stories the nationalist writers of the 1950s and beyond tell about the migrants are far more socially conservative than the stories that emerge from the colonial archive. In the civil and criminal records, Asian women are not docile. Black women do not stay at home while their partners migrate to the Canal Zone. Both groups of women often traveled independently of men. Many of these social behaviors recede in the post-1950s literary representations of both Asian and Afro-Caribbean women, until women writers emerge in the 1970s and 80s to challenge these illusions. That development demonstrates clearly how all forms of documentation reproduce the social constructs of their times. It reminds us, as Saidiya Hartman does in Lose Your Mother, of the violence inherent in the formation of any archive and the limits of seeing fictional reconstructions as unproblematic antidotes to the silences and partial vision of both colonial and digital archives.
So I just wanted to mention a few of the lessons that we learned in this project, but I realized we also forgot to thank the guest lecturers who participated in this, who included Vereen Shepard, Ramabai Espinay, Rhonda Frederick, Victor Chang, Sonia Watson, and others. So we were very, very lucky and privileged to have such scholars and artists participate in this project. We became aware that this was not simply a course about two migrations that made use of a digital archive and introduced students to digital humanities. Rather, these three were closely related, and we would need to develop a critical practice and pedagogy to make that relation visible and transformative. The migration of indentured Asians to the Caribbean and of Afro-Caribbeans to Panama and Latin America produced overlapping diasporas connected as products of the transition from British colonial to U.S. domination in the Caribbean and Latin America, and of Britain's exportation of labor from the subcontinent to support its late imperial projects, from sugar plantations in its Caribbean colonies to railroads in East Africa. Multiple and intersecting, these migrations constituted the heterogeneous, transnational, modern proletariat necessary to this new phase in modernization, empire, and capitalism. They rendered nations yet more heterogeneous and transnational, and they are now gaining scholarly attention because we are in a period of paradigmatic shift away from the nation and towards transnational frameworks in American, African American, and Caribbean studies, and in Latin American studies, where there is a growing interest in race and Afro-descendant populations. The digital archive is of critical importance to the study of these migrations and to the transformation of these disciplines. The archival materials that recorded the lives of these immigrants provide the data necessary to complicate and transform the traditionally teleological and homogenizing narratives of national history that undergird our scholarly disciplines. Historically, these documents have been available only to scholars with research budgets or who are located near specific national archives, but now with such with the growth of the digital archive, that readership is greatly expanding. Digital humanities is necessary because it has the potential to analyze this newly accessible, vast, and diverse archive in ways that extend and transform our traditional research methods, pedagogy, and scholarly genres so that they can address the scale and diversity of the digital archive, illuminating in new ways the relationship between migration, modernity, and literature. In order to continue to nuance our understanding of these diasporas and their relationship to nation states, in order to understand their role in shaping modernity, and ensure that these materials are visible and their significance legible for future generations, we need to collaborate with our students and our colleagues to develop new critical practices and pedagogies based in the digital archive and digital humanities, practices Donette Francis has dubbed digital intersectionality.
Okay. So this is not working? Okay. All right. So where Rhonda and Leah laid out the critical intervention, content, and reach of the course, I want to spend the remaining time discussing the politics and mechanics of mounting such a course, its portability, its pitfalls, and emerging best practices. So what did it mean to simultaneously work beyond and yet within disciplinary, institutional, and national boundaries? The first thing to underscore is that we were all tenured professors as we began this collaboration. While such collaborations can help sustain communities around our instruction in places where we may not have other field cohorts, it's important to think about the emerging and in many colleges and universities yet undefined nature of digital humanities assessment within the existing tenure protocols. This is even while universities begin to embrace and make hires in the digital humanities. So a gap remains, and this gap is something an assistant professor, for example, would have to consider seriously when mounting such a course. That said, junior professors are probably the most nimble with utilizing the various new technologies. Yet the value of this course remains for us is that it operated like a master class, creating a digital teaching commons where we pooled our individual research expertise, divvied up lecture preparations to share lectures amongst ourselves. In this teaching commons model, we rethought pedagogical authorship. And because we were simultaneously in conversation with each other as scholarly peers, it means that there was an additional layer of probing engagement around course materials and attending research questions. Students benefited from the virtual access to another subject area specialist beyond their institution. So I want to discuss what has emerged as best practices by thinking about what working with digital intersectionality as a conceptual orientation affords. So here I'm migrating the utility of Kimberly Crenshaw's use of intersectionality to the digital landscape. And by digital intersectionality, I mean understanding the interrelated and interdependent dynamics of course content, in this case, overlapping diasporas and the confluence of these labor migrations, the digital archive, DLOC, and digital humanities. So if we think intersectionally, we see that no one part is subordinated to the other, and that in fact they work in a complementary fashion. So thinking intersectionally enables us to worry less about content coverage as we did in the first iteration of the class, and instead, beginning with the logic of digital intersectionality allows us to think afresh about how humanities methodologies intersect with both our creation and use of digital archives as well as digital technologies. This was an awareness gained only after reflecting on our first version of the course as we gathered at Amherst this past August to refine what we might do differently in the second iteration of the course in spring of 2016. So to embed digital intersectionality into the very course construction, we retitled the course Digital New Worlds, Diasporas, Archives, and the Humanities, and we moved to a module as an organizing frame. The module operates as independent or standalone units that are a part of a greater whole, and our modules are now structured around various kinds of archival practices which we need digital humanities tools to implement. So titles of our modules, for example, are Reading the Colonial Archive, Working with Newspapers, Visualizing the Archives, Listening in the Archives, Building and Transforming the Archives. We think incorporating one module unit as a startup might be a good way of testing out incorporating such courses into one's own curriculum. For example, when we teach this course again, Evelyn O'Callaghan and her students at the University of the West Indies in Barbados will join us for one module. Furthermore, looking ahead at the various papers that will be presented over the next 48 hours and what they represent, the Caribbean Digital might be a module that we can incorporate in our various Caribbean Studies courses. So DLOC is critical to our instruction, and we were simultaneously teaching from this open source digital archive even while building it. So this twin process means that in theory and in practice, we have to take seriously the lessons learned from our own post-colonial critiques of the colonial archives and what Michelle Ralph-Trouillot so usefully showed us about how power steps in to establish silences in every phase of producing the archives and building knowledge. For example, what does it mean that on the one hand, we are working within an imperial archive from the Panama Canal Museum collection, and yet on the other hand, we ourselves as an intergenerational, interracial, feminist collective of US-based Caribbean literary scholars are now archive builders. For example, there are times when Rhonda Cobham's deep natal roots in Trinidad and her sustained networks of school and family contacts actually provide recognition, trust, and subsequent entree into family archives. So how does power manifest itself in our own creation of an archive? Do we archive all that is available to us? What selection decisions are we making? How does our critical humanities training prompt us to be attuned to carefully teasing out our own investments and divestments, even while remaining deeply committed to the opportunity that DLOC presents for supplementing and challenging the colonial archive? Finally, I want to conclude with an attention to the real boundaries that exist as we try to work across disciplines, campuses, and nations. It is important to be aware up front that each campus or site will have different levels of digital humanities awareness and support, and that matters. It makes a difference having a trained digital humanities scholar or specialist integrated in the course instruction. I, for example, did not, and though I was able to draw on the wealth of expertise of subject area librarians and glean knowledge from digital humanities specialists on other campuses, my course had a decidedly different sensibility. But working collaboratively provides an opportunity to build local institutional capacity. Mounting this course has also meant a commitment to professional development in the area of the digital. So while we've been working virtually, we've met over the past 2 years in physical institutional spaces for training. First at the University of Florida in August of 2013 to be trained in DLOC, and then again at Amherst in August of 2014 for further digital humanities training. Similarly, working transnationally means a hyper-awareness of our own position in the global north and attending institutional inequities and assumptions. Teaching such a class transnationally reminds us of the gaps in translation as we work not only across different understandings of the university, its mission and audiences, but also different disciplinary investments and methods of critique. Linguistic, cultural, and stylistic differences also matter. Yet it is precisely because to work on the Caribbean is to necessarily attend to embodied subjects and economic materialities that Caribbean digital initiatives provide an opportunity for us to be at the cutting edge of this emergent field. Our work thus far convinces us that mining these various gaps for archival, disciplinary, institutional, and transnational incommensurabilities actually open up a brave new Caribbean digital world, a potentially radical virtual public sphere of teaching, researching, knowledge sharing by literally building a web of transformative sites of knowledge production and consumption. Thank you.
Are we going to do Q&A now?
I think we do it all. I should go? Okay.
What do we want to do with the mic? Is this good? Okay. Hello. Good evening. I am Brooke Wooldridge, and as was said a couple of times, I think, I am the program director for the Digital Library of the Caribbean. And I am thrilled and honored to be here to share with you guys and to learn over the next, today and tomorrow, but also to see for the first time the concluding thoughts around the class of Panama Silver, Asian Gold, which I didn't participate in quite as much as I would have liked, but have kind of watched from afar how it develops. And it's been amazing to see the work that these three women have put into this course and the dividends that it has paid in so many ways, in not only the content that has come into DLOC, but envisioning how DLOC should work hand in hand with the scholars that are using the resources and how they can pull their institutions in to then feed back and grow not only the Digital Library of the Caribbean, but the field. And so it's been amazing to see this kind of spark of an idea develop into something that is now going to be continuously grown with the course in 2016. So often these things happen in a flash, and you're so exhausted afterwards that you run away and you never want to do it again. And I was thrilled to see that in 2016 it will be much easier, I promise. It will all be easier. Okay, so with that, I will start my presentation. The Digital Library of the Caribbean, raise your hand if you have never used the Digital Library of the Caribbean for anything. One? It's okay. No, it's really helpful for me to know, and that's okay. Two? Okay, perfect. All right, so it's a cooperative digital library for resources from and about the Caribbean and Circum-Caribbean. You've already heard that. I'm going to go through. What's interesting, I think, to note is that the conceptualization of the Digital Library of the Caribbean began back in 2003. And that was a really long time ago. I talk about digital projects and how they should be measured in dog years, because so many of them do have such a short life. And the Digital Library of the Caribbean is celebrating its 10th year. And I continue to be amazed at the vision of the three people that were the founders. One's photograph you saw in the first slide, Judith Rogers. has been around from the beginning. She's the director of the library at the University of the Virgin Islands. And it was Judith Rogers, along with the director of what was then the Digital Library Center at the University of Florida, and the Latin American and Caribbean librarian at Florida International University. Those were the three people that conceptualized this idea of building a shared digital archive, using the technology to grow capacity in the region and increase free open access to Caribbean research resources, leveraging the University of Florida's historical collections in the Caribbean. So that's kind of the idea. Quick facts, and anybody who's seen me present has seen this kind of grow and evolve with my presentations. We're now at 38 content contributing partners. Unfortunately, our one European partner was Kaiama, and many of you might know that they have now deacquisitioned their library holdings, and they're going to the University of Leipzig. Good news is they're digitizing those resources, and they will come into the Digital Library of the Caribbean. So good news, bad news. We're at 50 million page views. And these things are so generic and can be skewed in many, many ways, but these should be actual human beings looking at the pages inside of the archive, either the informational pages or the content themselves. And we're at 2.25 million pages of content. And this content spans from video to audio to newspapers to books to photographs to postcards. We have a very, very, very broad collecting scope. 15,000 titles with 90,000 items. So as you can see, there are a lot of serial publications, which are very, very, very useful. Training programs. Now the training programs are expanding. It used to be only in digital preservation. That was the focus of our work. And the last 3 years with Lori Taylor, the DLAC Technical Director's growing role in digital humanities, we are now working more on projects like the course that you just heard about, in incorporating not only training for digital preservation, but what do we do next? Where do we go from here? Scholarly collaborations, educational outreach, that's more my gamut. Before I did my master's at FIU, I was a high school Spanish teacher. And so I collaborate a lot with our Latin American and Caribbean Center at FIU and also the University of Florida for K through 12 outreach on the Caribbean. And so that hat I've never been able to take off. Shared governance is one of the keys to DLOC's success, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. And the kind of the meat of my presentation today are going to be 3 examples not similar to the course, but 3 examples like the course as an example of what you can do with this stuff. These are our partners. You can explore them online. Some have a little bit of content, some have a lot. And this is the newest piece of our project. In addition to our content contributing partners, the language gets very complicated now, but now we have content contributing partners and financially supporting members. When our federal funding, which was not a lot, but was pretty significant, about $100,000 a year from the Department of Education, dried up, we had to figure out how we were going to be sustainable into the future. And that's through kind of basically a 3-pronged approach. Institutional funding, both from the University of Florida and FIU, Florida International, in terms of the staff and the costs related to the technology and also the project management, which is what I do, and that is all covered by institutional funding. Also the institutional funding from the partners who pay to digitize their content, to acquire the equipment, to pay the staff. So the National Library in Haiti, the University Library at Cobham in the Dominican Republic, they pay their staff to digitize content. So that has a real monetary value. In addition, grant funding for projects. We're very, very happy to not be 100% dependent on grant funding for the infrastructure. So grant funding for projects, and then these membership dues, which are vital for us to be nimble. I'm going to talk about the new seed grant program that DLOC is now administering using these funds. These funds also go to support general infrastructure and training that we can't, and this is when videoing gets complicated, but we can't really use state budgets to train partners in the Caribbean. So these membership dues give us flexible funding to be able to do the things that we couldn't if we only relied on institutional funding. So if you didn't see your institution there, please talk to me. Anywhere from 250 to 10,000, depending on how many strings you can pull. Governance and ownership. DLOC doesn't make a claim to anything in its content, anything in its collection. We only request non-exclusive, you can do anything else you want with it, non-commercial digital distribution rights. So this enables us to provide access to materials that are still under copyright protection with the permission of the estate holders, and it allows the institutions that contribute the content to retain the ownership of their collections, unlike collaborations with commercial databases that often will restrict then access and future use of the materials. So not only does the free open access, in our opinion, help you as users, it also helps the institutions that are providing access, because the value of these collections is much greater than any royalty that they may get from locking down access into one specific commercial database. And DLOC is collaborative in its governance. The partners, when we only had 12 partners, everyone had a seat at the table. It became unwieldy as we grew, and now we have an elected body of, it ends up being about 14 with the ex officio executive board that help us make decisions regarding budget, policy, and the future growth of the institution. And that's one of the photos of an executive board meeting 2 years ago, I think. 2.25 million pages of content. Go in, see what we have that's interesting to you, and if there's a gap that you see, a gap that you identify, the only way we can know it is if you talk to us. So please register as a user, use the link at the bottom, send us a message. If you have access to collections that you may be able to help us secure permissions to digitize, that's the hardest part. So if you have those connections, please, the title of my talk is Scholars, Librarians, and Techies Required, and it's because we all need to work together to be able to make this collection what it should become. The technical infrastructure. It's built on an open source platform that was developed at the University of Florida specifically for their digital collections, as DLOC was developing at the same time. And so it recognizes a lot of the difficulties in terms of identifying and branding where the materials come from. I think of all of the digital content management, free and paid out there, DLOC does the best with recognizing where content comes from and handling serials. So that's kind of our plug of what we do best. We also link with the Florida Digital Archive, which all state institutions in Florida have access to, for long-term preservation and redundant backup. So not only are you making this stuff accessible today, it's going to be preserved and accessible into the future. Again, with Lori Taylor's arrival on the scene, in addition to building the archive itself, we began to develop and publicize and train people on our curators' tools. And so in addition to contributing content, we now also have the ability to identify curators for thematic collections and/or partner collections, where these curators can write it's basically any kind of web-based content management system. You can create the narratives that go around the documents in a specific collection, and the partners have the ability as well to use those curator tools. I'm going to go through just a few of what everybody has access to and then what specific people have access to. Everybody can create bookshelves, which you can then share with your students and/or research collaborators. Everyone can save searches for yourself for later because you never remember what you did, or send that search to someone else, and save and share items. Only specific authorized users can submit materials or edit metadata or make collections. So that's a higher level, thankfully. It's a very simple web web interface. Yeah, that's why they had training. This is an example of one of the bookshelves. So you can identify and create bookshelves related to specific content areas. You can see the librarian is coming out of me. I promise you there's only one more of these. And saved searches. All of the items we track usage statistics on, and anyone can see the usage for one specific item. But if you are a curator, you can see the collection level statistics for your resources. Okay. They were talking about in the class, the students created metadata, and I think that may or may not be a commonly known term. Yeah, we're good? Share? Okay. So metadata is what I have here. Metadata encoding transmission standards is one form of metadata. It's basically the new DH word for cataloging. That's all it is. It's not complicated. It's you've got to identify the content, make create the subject terms, identify the publisher, the title, all of that information for it to be able to be accessible later on. The interesting thing about the standard that we use, and it's important when you think about projects and you conceptualize projects, for you to think about the standards, to think about how they're going to last after your project ends. And being standards compliant is one of the important ways to do it. METS is the standard that we use. And so if at some point we were to decide that SOBEC was no longer the system we wanted to use, we have a standards-based metadata schema that we can pull everything out and dump it anywhere else that we wanted to. And so when you think about and conceptualize your projects, think about and work with people that have larger institutional linkages to make sure this stuff will last for long-term preservation. These METS files then have structural information, descriptive information, and administrative information. So you know where this image came from, where it fits in the scheme of the collection, and it's tied to that image, so long-term you're able to pull it out. And I already spoke about the Florida Digital Archive, which also uses the OAIS model for preservation, for digital preservation. Again, standards compliant. Okay, digital curation. Digital curation involves selection and appraisal by creators and archivists, evolving provision of intellectual access, redundant storage, data transformations, and for some materials, commitment to a long-term preservation. And it says for some materials, commitment to a long-term preservation because there's a cost associated with that long-term preservation that is reduced as you become involved in larger scalable projects, but there's still a cost. When you go into DLAC and you click on thematic collections, you're going to see why we need you. We need an army of scholars and their students to work with us to build these collections, to look at the gaps, to identify them, and to help us to fill them. So now I'm going to talk about, very quickly I have a feeling, 3 specific projects. In the back of the room, I left a little bit of literature, and one is the flyer for this project, Haiti and Island Luminous, which was curated over the course of 5 years by a graduate student at Florida International University. And when you talk about lessons learned, there were many, many lessons learned in this project. But what this project pretends to do is to contextualize the resources that we have in DLAC on Haitian history. From 4000 BCE, from the arrival of the first migrants to Hispaniola, all the way through 2013. It takes that history, breaks it down into 13 sections. Each section has a narrative with clickable links that then provide the context for between 2 to 5 resources that are available in DLAC. So basically, in 5,000 words, you can go through the transcourse of Haitian history, clicking through and linking back to resources inside of the Digital Library of the Caribbean. I would highly recommend you go in and take a look at this resource as a large-scale project. We did this project over 5 years with a total of about $30,000, and 100 scholars contributed from across the world, and we digitized a significant amount of content as well because creating the context identified the gaps. We realized where there was content missing. Pre-occupation, post-occupation, where are these gaps and how can we identify them? About Face was a much smaller, much more manageable curated exhibit. Something much closer to what I would recommend you do when you're starting. If I were to do Island Luminous over again, it would have been a $200,000 NEH project. And we did it over 5 years with $30,000. About Face was curated by Patrine Archer and Claudia Huck, and it recreated the first art exhibit to travel in Europe post-independence. And an article in the newest issue of the Jamaica Journal talks about the development of this exhibit. So if you haven't seen the newest issue of the Jamaica Journal, I highly encourage you to check that article out. But this exhibit goes through and, let me check my notes. The creation of this exhibit relied on the curatorial skills of Archer and Huck and the exhibit design experience of Santa Maria Wheeler. Rather than recreating the limits of the print world, Santa Maria Wheeler's training in museum studies provided a lens for the curators to create an interactive exhibit. Working through video conferencing, the two curators and exhibit designer discussed the possibilities of the online exhibit and worked through multiple drafts before deciding on a framework for the content to be accessible. So often the first step into digital humanities is basically to recreate what we write for the print world online, with the same format, the same limitations, the same structures. And so what they really tried to do in this exhibit was, let's think about what we can do differently because this is online and not just linked to the image in DLOG. And so I would encourage you, they then went and wrote an article. And you can do both, and then you get credit for two things. It's great. But don't write your article as your DH project. I guess that's kind of the takeaway and what we tried to do with About Face. Copyright. That's the other thing I wanted to talk about with this one. DLOG provided support for copyright clearance of the materials. Documented support for the rules of art reproduction are limited, but new resources are becoming available. This will get easier sooner, a little bit. Currently, the Indianapolis Museum of Art is creating a rights and reproductions handbook. So any of you that deal a lot with art and art reproduction, I would recommend you keep your eye out for this book that's coming soon. It was an Institute of Museum and Library Services grant. And it will become the handbook, the go-to of what do we have to do. One of the issues we had with About Face is a professional photographer took photographs of artwork for the exhibit. And towards the end of the exhibit, he wanted to claim copyright on his photographs of the artwork. And it was really unsettling for the scholars that were involved because it's confusing. Copyright is confusing. And if it's not transformative, there was no copyright. But relationships are important, and you don't want to put relationships in jeopardy because of creating an exhibit. Another thing that we did with About Face was we provided different levels of copyright access. Some materials are only available with thumbnails. Some materials, like the Edna Manley estate, requested that we wordmark their images, and others are, like Barrington Watson's estate, allowed us to put everything up, full high resolution, completely zoomable with no word marks. But that flexibility is important, and being willing to accept different levels of access can broadly open your resources. Okay. The last thing I'm going to talk about very quickly are the seed grants. And the seed grants are one of the ways that we're working to create new projects from the Caribbean with funding through DLOG. We're working on a thesis scanning project at the University of Suriname, 2 oral history projects, one in Curacao and another in the Bahamas on World War II. Any of you that work on Haiti, Bob Corbett's research materials that collected over the years, we're working on digitizing everything that he collected, held in a small private collection, and continuing to digitize the Aruba SO News and early postcards from Aruba. But the seed grant, the seed grants are funded through those memberships that I talked about earlier, and we want to be able to expand these that allow the partners in the Caribbean to identify, do they need money for staffing? Do they need equipment? Do they need training? And build resources and content that way. In closing, we are rethinking the way we're handling our Scholarly Advisory Board. And over the next 6 months, we're going to identify new opportunities and a new structure. And in the summer, we'll issue a call for new members of the advisory board. It's probably going to be a large advisory board with multiple components. These are some of the things that scholars are currently doing with us, but not necessarily in a recognized fashion. So we would like to formalize that process, and we would love the input of the people in this room and anyone you know that might be interested in helping us to define what should your role be and how can we work together to formalize it in a way that's beneficial to us and also to you as you work through your career in your institutions. So as I close, I want you guys to think about what happened in the course, the different types of exhibits, and what possible areas or avenues for collaboration might exist with the Digital Library of the Caribbean. That's it.
Thank you guys for, you can, okay. Such stimulating presentations to open our discussions on the Caribbean Digital. I am going to just open the floor for questions and see what happens. So, questions? David.
Thank you guys.
Hold on just a second. Please do, for the live stream.
Thank you guys for those presentations. At the risk of being thrown out of the room by Alex, Kaiama, and Kelly, I'm not a skeptic, so let me begin. I'm not really a skeptic. But my sense of the presentations was that there was an emphasis on the digital as new data, new content, a kind of emphasis on the digital almost as though it were a new empirical source. DLOC is a new kind of resource for materials that can be used in a variety of ways. So as I was listening to, and much inspired by the presentation of the course, I was thinking about my own very lax and perhaps very bad pedagogical practice. And I was wondering how someone like me might adapt the classroom for the kind of uses that you guys put the classroom to. Someone who is perhaps a little old-fashioned and who sees the classroom as not about necessarily introducing new kinds of data, new kinds of sources, but about reflecting on and talking about or being in a dialogue with students. If the emphasis is on new data, new resources, and my pedagogical practice doesn't care very much about the empirical material, don't throw me out. But how do I think about what it is you guys are doing? What new kind of pedagogical practice is being introduced? Is partly the question that I'm very haltingly asking.
Yeah, I'll take that one as the token old fogey on the panel, right? So you describe yourself as the person who introduced us described herself as a recovering technophobe. I'm not even recovered. I can still barely turn on the machines in my classroom. So one of the ways in which this has really revolutionized my teaching has been the way it has forced me to collaborate with other people in the classroom. My head of institutional research basically co-taught the course with me. She came to every single class. She sat there. She worked between her and my student, Kim Bain, who was the TA for the course. They worked all that stuff. So one of the things I don't think this should be about is about somebody having to completely retool how they approach the stuff that they do. I just don't think I have the time left in my life to do that, even though there are some technologies that I've become interested in and want to learn more about. So there's that. That's how it changes your pedagogy. It makes you have to decenter yourself as the teacher, as the instructor in the classroom in relation to people who have traditionally been seen as support staff. Those support people become teaching partners at one level. So that's one thing. The other thing that has pushed me towards this is that in some ways it's not that different from what I was doing 25, 30 years ago, when in order to write about Caribbean literary history, we first had to reissue the novels that we were talking about. Get the Beacon back out there, get the Caribbean Quarterly available in some ways. It wasn't so much that the material was new, but in order to make the kinds of arguments you wanted to make, you couldn't do it without making that material available to support your arguments, right? So the whole business, we haven't really talked that much about content, but the whole business about the Indo-Caribbean stuff. If you go on DLOC now, there's a lot of stuff about Haiti, there's a lot of stuff about the Dominican Republic, there's a lot of stuff about the Anglophone Caribbean. There's almost nothing about Asian Caribbean people. I'm not saying that that's new data. We all know that data is out there. But when I make an argument like, look at what happens to those images, those two kinds of images, and what does it mean that certain ways of imagining the national subject get to be privileged in relation to others. It makes a difference to be able to make that argument with the material there. The material has always been there. It's just not been accessible to everybody. So you make these arguments and they become footnotes as opposed to the things that actually drive the analysis that's going on. So for me, that's what it's not so much about the data. It's more about where and in what context we see that data when we're talking about these things. When we pick up, what would happen, for instance, if we introduced as metadata a term for the cataloging of these things. To use very straightforward things, is what happens if Panama becomes a subject entry when you look for lambing? We could get that, right? We all have done that. But when we do it for Kincaid, right? And when we do it for another, so you see these people emerging, talking about Panama in all kinds of different ways. And then at the same time, you do the same thing for the data on the Indo-Caribbean stuff, and you see this parallel terms emerging, and an argument begins to emerge that takes the discussion further, both politically, in terms of aesthetic stuff, and in terms of history. I think that we need those tools, and it's so easy in the Caribbean to be isolated. If I work in Haiti, I don't know about the Dominican Republic. If I work in the Dominican Republic, I certainly don't know about Indo-Caribbean people. I will never be able to do all those things, but I can provide a way for my students to think about what it means to put those things into relationship with each other by introducing them to tools that allow them to take the knowledge they have and combine it in new ways.
I would just add to that quickly that I think the humanities as a method, or humanities analytics, does not fall out, right? I think it only supplements and complements that. So for example, we get to teach, we theorize what the colonial archives are and what the problem with it is. But when they get to actually reconstruct, first of all, see it in practice, and then have to reconstruct it with their own metadata or trying to write alternative endings in one particular assignment, I think the class provides an opportunity for them to operationalize how we do humanities as an analytic, right? So I think I'm slightly resistant to your claim, David, that it is about adding more data or empirical information. I think it's about, where we come in and what animates our work is to think about how is it as humanists, how is it as Caribbean scholars, we're getting them to think through with us not only the materials, but how we even arrive at the materials and then what we can do with them.
And I guess I'm just going to repeat a little bit of or re-emphasize what Donette said, because I was thinking this was actually a very conservative course in terms of methodology. We were doing close reading. We were going into the physical archives and having them look at old documents and talking about these old documents. So it was it was old-fashioned in a basic way, but it made students aware that, well, first of all, libraries are trying to make students understand that libraries are important. And my students, as I actually ended up teaching the course twice, my undergraduates were most moved by going and seeing this partially cataloged series of images of West Indians in Panama, and seeing how they had originally been cataloged. And one, for instance, was this really interesting image of a family that's kind of overexposed, probably, first 10 years of the 20th century. And so the child was probably moving, so you can't see the child, and the back of it scribbled this word, and you can't see, and it ends up saying, like, it says native on back, probably, right? So it's someone who's trying to figure, but they see, right, then, like, they get involved in how the archive itself is constructed, and then they can help, like, shift the way that's actually cataloged. But it makes them think about the library differently, and it makes them think about the field differently and think about knowledge differently, because they see it as not such like a concrete thing, but something that gets constructed through these very specific material political processes. So I think for them, and at the same time seeing like how the internet like their authors weren't covered, right? Why was that? So it really, I think, involved them not only with the library as an active thing, but with knowledge differently. So that's what it is.
Kim.
Hi, I actually have two questions. One, I guess, a theoretical question, and another about DLOC. And so the one question is asking you to kind of pressure a little bit your use of the term digital intersectionality and how you see that relating to intersectionality as it emerges from Black feminist praxis. Do you think it kind of helps us think differently about how it's used in kind of feminist circles, or what the relationship you see between those two things? And the other is whether in DLOC there's a way, if you're tracking or have a sense of whether what people look for changes over time. I don't know enough to ask, like to use the terms to ask, but if in the beginnings of DLOC people are asking certain questions of your archive as opposed to, say, 5 years down the line, like what kinds of things are people demanding from your archive as it evolves?
Let me go first. What's interesting is it's hard to answer that question because while the searches have changed over time, the content has also changed over time. And so and what we've promoted in terms of what the content is has changed over time. We definitely have different user groups. We have a really strong focus on Haiti. We have a lot of Haitian content, so we have a lot of people that are definitely using the research for Haiti. Because of Leah's work, we have a really strong Anglophone Caribbean early literature collection, and so I think that has grown over time. We have the Aruba Esso News, which was the newspaper of the oil corporation in Aruba, and that's one of our most popular resources. Why? Because of local historians in Aruba. It's not anybody on the outside that I can think of that are really mining that resource, but it really is, it's got like 300,000, 400,000 views. And there aren't that many people. But people doing family histories. We have a phone book from Cuba from the 1950s that's got 800,000 page views. So it really does run the gamut, and I think it's hard to answer that question because in the beginning we had a really strong collection on Carafesta, and that was one of our strongest collections, so it got a lot of usage. Now that we have more content, as a percentage, it has less of an impact on our usage.
So I would say that as as a scholar, I sort of bring my Black feminist genealogy in terms of a historiography to my critical practice in the classroom. And so as we're sitting and trying to make sense of how we're going to redo this class, it became clear to me all of my sort of anxieties about the different hierarchies, overlapping methods, different social identities that both we were inhabiting. And so all of that came to bear in terms of how I understood myself self-consciously participating in this project. And so for me, it's a deliberate move to think digital intersectionality, because I do want to sort of bring a Black feminist genealogy into it, and the way that it forces us to be aware of not only sort of where that scholarship comes from, but I think how it forces us to inhabit a critical practice. And so I think one of the things that you're suggesting is that perhaps I do more of that work if I were to write this up, right? And I will do that. Thank you.
We're going to get a question from Alex, who has a question from online.
Talking about la mise en relation, I have a question here from Twitter from Natalie Burr at the University of Miami. Says
Bauer.
Bauer, sorry, I pronounced it.
I just wondered if I knew that person. That's
Yeah, Natalie Bauer. Yeah. Sorry, Natalie. Platforms for digitized collections provide access to paper-based materials. But what about historical and contemporary born digital?
It is me. In terms of born digital archiving, we are doing some born digital archiving, but it's not a major collecting focus really yet for us, just in terms of staff. There are some institutions that are doing great work with web archiving, and it's not really where our strength is in terms of the Digital Library of the Caribbean. And there's so much work that we're doing on the historical side that we have oral histories and videos and the work from the courses that all come back into the Digital Library of the Caribbean as materials, presentations, papers, theses, those kind of things that are born digital that come in. But if I know your question, it's related to web archiving, and that's not something that we're doing. And it definitely is being done topically more than regionally, as far as I know.
Sorry, could you clarify for me what that last part, what it means being done regionally?
So they're like digital humanities, like digital human rights web archiving projects, or topical-based web archiving practices.
Oh, okay, I get the
may
regionally.
include the Caribbean, but not something that's focused on the Caribbean across the board.
Nija and then Rafe.
Thanks so much. This conversation is really exciting to me because I also felt that there was a way that the entire panel was also thinking about a theory of the digital archive, and I really appreciated how much effort went into also constructing a theoretical language around the objects that you're encountering in the classroom. And I guess the question I have, maybe a way to get back to the intersectionality question and the digital, but it was about metadata and how the class, from your own experience, came to like theorize and think about metadata. And I guess one example was the Panama image, and this question about how metadata at once was connected with visibility and searchability. I thought that was just really fascinating, that how does searchability and visibility become connected? And with that image in particular, what I found really fascinating, and this is the intersectional piece, was that there's a question about method, because on the one hand, we could try to identify a Black subject, but then the image was also a stereoscope, right? There was a stereoscopic image, so there are multiple methods happening here. one, can you catalog the image through metadata, right? But can you mobilize metadata in order to theorize the image as well as in its form, right? So there's a way in which just the object as we encounter it in the digital archive forces us to move across multiple methods, but how do those methods then become couched within this term called metadata? And can we kind of unpack metadata with the many different kinds of intersecting datas? I tried, I'm not sure if it worked. That's already bound up in there. So I wanted to see if you could talk more about how your class could teach us more about metadata and its uses in the digital archive.
Well, I'm going to dodge this question a little bit because I can't, my brain isn't quite sharp enough. I mean, one of the things, so I'll start by saying two things and then maybe something will occur to me to address, or maybe you can help me think through this. Metadata is also a negotiation, like space is a negotiation. So, for instance, I presented this information, and Lori Taylor is always, there is a archivist's imperative to include people who have been excluded from the archive. I can't remember what it's called, I don't know the language, but it exists. But a lot of archivists, because I said, look, all we have to do is say, there's a West Indian laborer or a probable West Indian laborer somewhere in the metadata. It could be in the notes, it could be the keyword. It doesn't have to say this person is X. It doesn't even have to say this person is a West Indian. And one of the head archivists from my university said, no, you don't know that. It could have been a black person who walked off the street and happened to be standing there. You can't add that. And he didn't care really that, Panama was a military zone, everyone else had been removed. I mean, so there's a negotiation about shifting these terms. It's not necessarily an easy negotiation to have. And so that's another part of it that I just wanted to add to it.
But you're asking a question too about the stereoscopic
exactly.
things and images, and this was something I learned that I didn't know about. The photo documentation of the Panama Canal is one of the biggest collections of these stereoscopic things. So there's an entire history or way of thinking about those images and what they allow you to do and how they allow you to see that somebody needs to write a book about it. This isn't going to be me. But this was something that when we were trying to work out where these images like that and the image of the Indian girl that I showed, that's from a series. There's a whole moment at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, where these exotic photos of exotic women are being taken, and there's a whole provenance to photographs like that when we were doing that section, we had students read about, and so they got to understand. So the first assignments we got about them were people saying things like, Jamaican woman on a donkey, she's looking away from the camera, she feels exploited. And the students are doing all this stuff, and we were just kind of going like, hang on, read the photograph before you start, imposing this kind of presentist notion on what you think is going on in this photograph. When is it taken? Where is it taken? Who is it showing? How are these pictures posed? How is this pose related to the way in which other subjects like this are posed in other kinds of colonial settings? All that sort of stuff. And it was a way to get students away from this, everything works out to fall into three categories that we know, about race, sex, and gender or something like that. And so by focusing on those aspects of it, which, we can't repeat now. I mean, we did the readings, we had the experts come in and talk to the students about, but by focusing on those things, you're kind of saying this thing comes from a particular place. There was a particular photographer who was taking these things, who had a certain theory about what the image should be. And that theory is happening at a moment in the colonial development of tourism. Actually, this is one of the things we came up with, and and how these images shift over time from the exotic subject to the landscape, and all those kinds of things. I mean, we were way out of our league by the time we got there. But what we were saying to the students is those things matter, and you're not going to be good at talking about this thing if you just look at an image like this and just see picture of woman. This woman is feeling X. You can't say that. And so part of going back to that level was just kind of getting them to embed what they were responding to, as viewers, to a methodology and a history and a set of issues that they just weren't aware of.
And I think we were lucky, this is a kind of grant intersection, which is that there was a grant at my university to digitize the over 200 stereographs of various, starting actually from the dairy, when the U.S. sent, starting from earlier in the 19th century, and various different, anyway. So we were able to kind of say, hey, if you can't do everything, make sure you do the ones involving West Indians. So that was where we kind of, and then because they could say we were doing the course, that gave them kind of money to do it. And so there's a kind of interesting, but what I wanted to get at is that the stereographs, not only are they kind of technologically interesting, but they have reverse sides, except they're really cheap ones, right? And so it gives the students a kind of way of seeing the reverse side and how they're explained. And one of the examples, because some other students in museum studies picked images about West Indians in Panama, and they chose an image of a young man with next to a soursop tree, right? But they didn't. My class went kind of crazy when they saw this as an example of what West Indians did in their free time, right? Because they knew that the reverse side of that said that it was actually a stereograph about soursops, and it was explaining how big a soursop was, and that it was about the size of a small child's head, right? And so their ability, so the fact that they are stereographs and they come with that context, and you can see you can often kind of trace the company and the type of, like what kind of entertainment they were doing, and they have, and I guess it's also useful that they're very different types of photographs. So they're the official photographs from the construction that the U.S. was paying for, and then there are these stereographs that are trying to push, so I think, so even without thinking about the technology of the actual photography, the stereographs themselves are very powerful and useful.
Can I just say one more thing? And this is kind of going back to David. One of the reasons that this way of photography was so popular in talking about the canal was it was one of the few ways in which you could represent the vastness of the Panama enterprise, right? I mean, you're moving whole mountains and creating these locks. I mean, when you look at these photographs are meant to be able to allow you to see almost in 3 dimensions something that tells a story about American technological supremacy. And so the figures in the photographs are there to suggest the dimensions, the relationship between the dimension of the human and the dimension of the machine. But they're really pictures of the machine. When you look at them as pictures of the human beings, then instead of seeing the human being as just the glass that tells you how big the podium is, you begin to have to ask questions about the relationship between the human subject and the technological thing that's going on. So rather than them seeing them as like the donkey in the photograph, you begin to see them as a co-creator of this kind of technological space. And a lot of the other documents that we got, the descriptions of the ways that the workers described their own participation in the canal, were descriptions that placed them at the forefront of what was going on. They weren't talking about being scared of this stuff. They were talking about, yeah, I blew up that hill, or I was part of the moment when we built that kind of thing. And so the relationship that emerges from the photograph when you pair it with these first-hand accounts begins to tell a different story about what's happening in terms of modernity and the emergence of a particular kind of modern subject that is lost if you look at it in this other way, where it's just, here is the big machine, and here's the black person who is anonymous, who looks like an ant in relation to the big machine. And that's a whole different way of reading what's going on. And it allows you to use what is in fact a colonial archive to tell a different kind of story about the human subject.
And kind of said one sentence, which is, it became very clear to me that with all these kind of U.S. propaganda, we are wonderful, we have built this, we have separated these continents kind of narrative. You can tell those narratives without black people. You can just cut them out of the text. But you can't cut them out of these photographs. They're just not cuttable out. You can't remove West Indians. No, but there's just so many of them. And even, and so anyway, that was one of the things that just kept hitting me as we would see these images, and we'd watch contemporary, like this contemporary entertainment kind of video about how, Teddy Roosevelt built the canal and overcame the mosquito and, right? But the hand that's pushing the button to blow up the dynamite is a black hand in the film. So it just, and when the students have seen the historical one and they can see these kind of cheesy, contemporary takes on it, anyway, this is kind of old-fashioned teaching stuff, but there's a lot to be done with the photographs.
I'm going to go with Rafe, and then Kaiama will close us out.
So my question is about pedagogy, and I think it's not unrelated to what David was asking. And I'm thinking about how we train our students and the kinds of academic work that gets privileged. So seeing the final projects that your students were doing, they were building something, which is very DH, right? And I've tried to incorporate that into my own teaching of encouraging them for a final project as an option to do a DH project to build something. When we talk about it, though, we talk a lot about how building something is kind of the dirty work, and an analysis is what is more interesting, and that we value more, I guess. So I'm wondering, how do we balance that in teaching, between training our students to build something that's going to be useful to the field, that is, great for knowledge and expanding knowledge, versus training them to do something that the academy is going to value in a way that will help them, in their careers, I guess.
I don't know.
So I have an easy answer. For me, the analysis has to be built into the tool building.
Yeah.
So don't build anything for me if it doesn't have analysis. I have no interest in that. So for me, those kinds of divides, and I think this is why I'm sort of invested in trying to think the way that's being explained here. I think all of those things have to come together in terms of how we work with digital humanities. I don't want people to throw 50 million tools at me, because if there's no analysis, I'm not interested. So I guess that's how I'd answer the question in an impatient way, but a sincerely impatient way.
And I think something else that's important and something we should probably grapple with more tomorrow is how to recognize, as long as the analysis is there, how to recognize this new DH work in the field. Is it that you have to write an article about it after you do the project, or what are the ways in which it can be recognized as valuable in its own right? And universities are getting better at that.
Yeah, and I think we didn't, this is what we wanted to do at a much deeper level than we did the first time. The first time we were just putting stuff together. But we were, one of our emphases was, particularly with Missy Rosa at Amherst, was to teach students how to analyze digital projects themselves. And for me, it's as we would read new texts and watch films, to analyze the metadata so that students were analyzing the tools as they were learning them. And that's something that we think we have to come up with, something deep, more of that type of thing, and beyond it. But that's kind of what we learned, is that you have to integrate at a pretty deep level the analysis and the tool. And
is this, yes. So Rafe's question just so nicely closed the circle, and I was just going to ask something prosaic about logistics and tacky about money. So I'll ask you that while we eat Caribbean food, and let Kelly close this off.
About money?
money?
She's gonna.
Okay,
I was actually thinking that.
Yeah.
That,
we basically did this without money. I mean,
The first.
It was more than money. I wanted to know how
Resources.
How much time it took for you to get the necessary ducks in order institutionally and infrastructurally to put this on, and how the Techie part is how you were compensated beyond.
we were not compensated.
But that's why I began with, we were all tenured professors, right? Because, I mean, this is a pedagogical,
How did you get an institution to stand behind you?
Well, there are a couple of actual points. One, the DLOC has a platform and it has a staff. I mean, we went down there and it was the three of us, and I think we met with 9 different people in the course of 4 days who took us through everything from how to write an assignment that made sense of some of this stuff to, roomfuls of uncatalogued materials, and it was just like, choose what you want us to put up here. So that was there because the University of Gainesville has this Title VI situation, and they also have this digital tool. So that was there. Amherst has a ton of money. And so, we have to tell you the numbers on this course, right? So I had 7 students. Leah had...
I had 5 the first time, but I had 28 the second time.
And you had...
About 17, I think.
17. So we used to joke sometimes that we had more people working on this course than there were students in the courses. But because Amherst had a lot of money for digital grants, the second round, we were able to finance just by me going and saying, I want a digital grant to do X. One of the things we're trying to do to leverage for the next time around is to have Donette use it as a capacity building tool at her university. But what the librarians kept on telling me every time I apologized yet again for taking up all their lives was look, we're using this as a pilot project. If this thing works in your course, we will use what we learn by working with you to help other people to create modules that do some of this stuff in their course. So we were able, because of the point in the DH stuff that our college was at, we were able to use it as a kind of pilot project to do certain things. I mean, the other thing we should say, though, is that it has spawned work. So, Kim is now the Digital College Digital Humanities Fellow who's doing stuff that I don't even understand now with this kind of stuff. Danishri down in Florida, she's been working on papers that do these things. So it's not just how many resources went into these courses, it's what kind of research came out of those courses and where are students taking this next. I had one of my students who's bilingual go down to Panama, work with the people at SAMAP to help work out. One of the things we discovered is that there's no course at an advanced level in Panama that deals in any way with the Caribbean, the West Indian presence in Panama. It's just not taught at the school level, at the university level. We thought we were going there to collaborate with people who were doing things like us. We were doing much more than they were doing. And so then, you get these kinds of exchanges. So my student went around and talked to all these people during the celebration of the opening of the Panama Canal. She came back with, 16 different projects that everybody in Panama wanted us to do. And we had to go like, wait a minute, we don't do that, right? But so there's an intersection of resources right now as colleges try to move into digital stuff. But you should also know that when we began this course, we didn't even know most of this language. We didn't begin it because we were going to go into this new trendy digital humanities stuff. We did it because it was the only way to get at what we wanted to think about in relation to some of this stuff. And it's in the course of that we become converted to thinking about that. At least that's true for me. I don't know about the others, but it was definitely not something I ever imagined I would be doing.
We need to thank our institutions, and particularly the librarians, and this is something that Rhonda always emphasizes, is that there's a shifting relationship between the librarian and faculty.
Yeah.
But not just DLOC, but the libraries at the University of Florida gave up an enormous amount of labor, and I got a grant of $3,000. But that was all going to be for digitization, and they took on all the digitization costs themselves, and we could then use that for guest lectures. So our institutions were very generous. But I didn't have to go through any process of having the course approved or any bureaucratic thing like that. This is completely from the administration doesn't know this is happening. The library knows it's happening.
That's why.
Exactly.
We're live streaming.
But that's why I think that the modules, the way that we're trying to conceptualize the modules is so important, because I don't think everybody who tries to do this should have to do it from scratch.
Exactly.
And so part of the other thing that DLOC does is we can upload those modules to the course. So now we're working on flipped classroom things that will do mini lectures and that sort of stuff. And it will just be like, okay, you want to teach this course? You can do 1, 2, 3. Like in Barbados, they know all about the Panama stuff. They know nothing about the Asian stuff. How are they going to do that? Are they going to do both? Are they just going to pull out what we're using in Panama and use it to do their digital course? Are they going to use it as a basis to build a course that's about digital humanities, but not necessarily about Panama? The modules have to work for everybody, else they're just not worth the resources that have been poured into creating them?
Well, that actually, it still works in terms of a circle. Also in terms of make it work, because we're thinking about pedagogy. And tomorrow morning, our first panel, or first session, is on archival and pedagogical praxis. So we'll be, of course, continuing this conversation. So thank you to our first panelists.